The cockpit is calm for a moment. Morning light, routine chatter, a checklist that has been read 1,000 times before. Then, without warning, the trim wheel starts to spin. The nose of the brand new 737 MAX nudges down as if grabbed by an invisible hand. A warning chime cuts through the air, then another. Red lights, stick shaker. The pilots pull back, engines roar, altitude tapes unwind. They are fighting the airplane. Not weather, not a blown engine. A hidden software system quietly deciding that the jet is about to stall and must be forced toward the ground. The captain calls for flaps, for power, for help. The first officer scans a forest of alerts that make no sense. The nose keeps dropping. They regain a little height, then lose more. Passengers feel their stomachs float. Coffee spills. Someone screams. On the flight deck, trained professionals, thousands of hours in the sky, are reduced to wrestling a machine that will not listen. Seconds later, the ground rises to meet them. Impact, silence. Then the world turns on. Newsrooms cut from weather reports and sports scores to burning wreckage and twisted metal. Breaking news banners flash across screens in Jakarta, in Addis Ababa, in New York. Two modern jets, less than 5 months apart, fall out of the sky in almost the same way, leaving families staring at arrival boards that never change. Reporters repeat a single name again and again: Boeing. Not only the biggest plane maker in the world, for decades it was the company that symbolized safety, precision, American engineering might. There was a time when flying on a Boeing meant trust. The same brand that helped win World War II, that carried astronauts, presidents, entire economies. Its aircraft stitched together business, tourism, and family life, turning the planet into a network of overnight journeys and casual weekend trips. This empire of aluminum and software printed money and projected power, all on the promise that every bolt, every line of code had a reason. So what happens when the world's most trusted plane maker quietly trades engineering culture for financial engineering and Wall Street's approval? When schedule and share price begin to outrank test data and pilot training? The answer is not just 2 crashes. It is hundreds of lives lost, billions of dollars erased, a brand shattered, and a deeper story that goes far beyond a single software system or a single bad decision. Because this is not only about MCAS or a $2 sensor. It's an example of what happens when a company built by obsessive engineers is slowly steered by balance sheets, when safety margins become cost centers, when regulators become customers to charm instead of watchdogs to fear. His story is one of corporate life, money, and power, at times inspiring and at times chilling, and Boeing followed a similar arc. So let me take you back to Boeing's golden age, through the McDonnell Douglas merger that rewired its DNA, into the rushed birth of the 737 MAX, the crashes, the internal messages and cover-ups, and the reckoning that still hasn't fully arrived. There was a time when the name Boeing didn't make passengers nervous, it made them proud. This was the company that helped win World War II by flooding the skies with B-17 flying fortresses and B-29 superfortresses, metal swarms that turned the tide of air power and rewrote the playbook of industrial war. Not only did it arm the Allies, it showed the world what a focused engineering empire could do when money, talent, and national will all pointed in the same direction. After the war, that same empire turned from bombers to passengers. The 707 shrank the planet, taking journeys that once took days by sea and compressing them into a single night over the Atlantic. The 747, the queen of the skies, stacked people in double decks and made long-haul flying feel almost casual, a routine miracle of aluminum and jet fuel. For decades, Boeing meant progress, meant safety, meant a future where distance was a technical problem, not a life problem. Inside the company, there was a culture to match. Old school engineers would say that every bolt had a reason. Every line on a blueprint was argued over, tested, and defended. His story is one of obsessive detail. Slide rules, wind tunnel tests, endless simulations, and a quiet pride that passengers would never know their names, but would trust their work with their lives. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this mindset built machines that carried heads of state, entire families, and whole economies through the sky. But let me take you back to the moment when that story bent. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, and on paper, Boeing bought its rival. In practice, many of the top seats went to McDonnell executives who had survived their own decline by learning to please Wall Street more than test pilots. The center of gravity shifted. Engineering excellence slowly gave way to financial engineering, to quarterly earnings calls, to a new question in meeting rooms. Not, is this safer, but can this hit the margin target? From that point, Boeing became a symbol of something larger. It still represented human ingenuity, the ability to design machines that fly 7 miles up at nearly the speed of sound. But it also became a case study in how that ingenuity can be weaponized against safety when profit becomes the only metric, when cost-cutting, schedule pressure, and market share quietly outrank redundant sensors and extra training hours. The 737 MAX disasters were not freak accidents, not random lightning strikes on an unlucky design. They were the predictable outcome of a cultural shift where financial targets overruled engineering instincts, where the pressure to answer Airbus's A320neo quickly led to bolting new engines onto an aging airframe and promising airlines they wouldn't need expensive simulator sessions. And this story reaches far beyond aviation. Any industry where complex systems meet cost-cutting is vulnerable. Cars whose software can be patched over the air but whose brakes are built to a price. Hospital devices driven by procurement spreadsheets. Social media platforms tuned for engagement, even if that means harm. It's an example of what happens when the people who sign the checks stop listening to the people who understand the risks. So in this video, the timeline is clear. From a culture where every bolt had a reason, to one where executives quietly asked how cheap they could make something and still pass certification. From bombers and queens of the skies to hidden software and single-point failures. Next, the story moves inside that transition, into the boardrooms, the design meetings, and the fateful decision to create the 737 MAX the way they did. From bombers and queens of the skies to hidden software and single-point failures. That fall from grace only makes sense if you know how high Boeing once stood. There was a time when the company on the banks of the Duwamish River in Seattle felt less like a corporation and more like a cathedral to engineering, where the altar was a drafting table and the priests wore oil-stained flight jackets. Let me take you back to the 1950s and 60s. Long before spreadsheets and quarterly earnings calls, the tools of power were slide rules, sharpened pencils, and vellum sheets pinned to massive wooden boards. Rows of engineers hunched over drawings for wings, spars, and control systems, arguing about airflow and fatigue cycles with the intensity other people reserved for money or politics. Test pilots walked those halls like minor celebrities, not because they were glamorous, but because they were the ones who strapped into unproven machines and brought back hard data written in G-forces and control pressures. Inside that world, there was an unwritten rule everyone understood. If a design wasn't safe, it didn't fly. Accountants could complain, managers could plead, but when it came to a critical system, An engineer could look at a vice president and simply say no. Design reviews were infamous, brutal, technical, and uncompromising. A young engineer might spend months on a component only to have a senior designer rip it apart in 10 minutes, not to humiliate them, but because the laws of physics were even more ruthless than any boss. The results of that culture reshaped the sky. The 707 didn't just appear, it was the product of a company willing to bet its life on the jet age, pouring resources into a commercial jetliner when the market was unproven and the risks were enormous. Then came the 747, the queen of the skies, a plane so huge that Boeing had to build an entirely new factory just to assemble it. Wings were overbuilt, structures carried generous safety margins, and systems were duplicated and triplicated. It was engineering paranoia turned into metal, a flying empire of redundancy designed to keep passengers alive even when multiple things went wrong. Yet even in those glory days, the tension was already there. Schedules slipped, budgets blew up, and there were late-night meetings where someone quietly asked how to shave weight or cost. But the shared belief still held the line. It's an example of what happens when a company agrees that safety is the one argument you never try to win on price. That belief would not stay unchallenged. As Boeing grew from a regional manufacturer into a global symbol of American wealth and power, another force entered the room. The language of Wall Street, of margins and shareholder value, began to whisper over the roar of wind tunnels. And soon, the engineers in Seattle would discover what happened when those whispers turned into orders from above. There was a time when Boeing's greatest brag wasn't its stock price, but a drawing room full of slide rules and test data. That era ended quietly, not with an explosion in the sky, but with a signature on a merger agreement in 1997. On paper, Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas. In the boardroom, it looked the other way around. McDonnell executives, veterans of a company that had been losing the commercial race, suddenly began appearing in the most powerful seats: CEO, president, key financial posts. The old Boeing engineers joked that they had won the name and lost the company. It sounded like a dry line. It was also a warning. Let me take you back to the cultural clash that followed. Boeing's life had been built on an engineering-led ethos: overbuild the wing, overtest the fuselage, argue in design reviews until the safest answer wins, even if it costs money. McDonnell Douglas came in with a different religion. Their reputation was for squeezing programs for cash, delaying upgrades, stretching aging designs, and treating each airplane as a financial asset first and a flying machine second. One culture measured margins of safety. The other measured margins on quarterly reports. Because of that shift in power, the language inside Boeing began to change. Meetings that once revolved around load factors and failure modes now opened with charts on return on invested capital and earnings per share. Executives talked about unlocking shareholder value, protecting the franchise, and delivering to the street. The new leadership pushed stock buybacks, aggressive cost targets, and bonuses tied directly to the stock price. For engineers who had grown up dreaming about lift coefficients, it felt at times inspiring and at times chilling to realize that the real audience now sat on Wall Street. The changes were subtle at first, but relentless. Cost-cutting initiatives swept through factories. Long-time suppliers were pushed to slash prices or be replaced. Work that had once been jealously guarded in-house was outsourced to contractors around the world in the name of efficiency and flexibility. Internal programs were judged not by how much risk they removed, but by how much non-recurring cost they saved. It's an example of what happens when a company built on technical excellence starts practicing financial engineering instead. Engineers still spoke about redundancy and fail-safes, but the pressure above them spoke a different language. Hit the schedule, hit the numbers, don't miss the guidance. Budgets for testing were trimmed. Travel for on-site oversight was questioned. The old joke that Boeing builds it, then counts the money, flipped into something harsher. Count the money first, then see what can be built, right? From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. The airplane still flew. The order books were full. Profits rose. Executives celebrated record wealth, and the empire looked stronger than ever. Yet inside design rooms and safety boards, a quiet unease settled in. Something foundational in Boeing's identity had shifted, and the real test of that new philosophy was still waiting over the horizon. Inside Boeing, that unease eventually walked into conference rooms and took a seat at the table. There was a time when the loudest voice in those rooms belonged to the test pilots and the gray-haired engineers, the people who had worn flight suits, flown prototypes, and carried the memory of friends lost in test crashes. Now, the head of the table often belonged to someone with a spreadsheet, a McDonnell Douglas resume, and a mandate: hit the quarterly target. The accent shifted from aerodynamics to EBITDA. Let me take you back to a closed-door 737 MAX program review. On one side, veteran engineers argued that bolting larger engines onto a 1960s airframe demanded deeper redesign, more testing, more time. On the other, newer finance-oriented managers pointed to Airbus's A321neo orders, a ticking clock, and a slide that read, "No simulator impact." Extra wind tunnel runs were questioned. Flight test hours were treated like a luxury. The message was clear. The schedule was the safety margin. Because of this new logic, critical work was pushed to cheaper contractors, sometimes overseas, sometimes with engineers making single-digit dollars per hour. Internal emails later showed senior staff complaining that they were designing the plane with the lowest bidder and begging for more time. One engineer who raised concerns about outsourcing flight control software described being invited off key meetings. Another wrote, "I was punished for doing the right thing after insisting a safety analysis be redone." The incentive structure made those punishments rational. Executive pay was now heavily wired to stock performance, to cost cuts, to share buybacks that showered money on investors and leadership. Long-term R&D, redundant sensors, extra simulator sessions, these were not innovations. They were line items to be trimmed. When a manager asked whether a safety change would trigger expensive pilot retraining, the real question was whether it would trigger a hit to the share price. Down the org chart, younger employees learned the lesson. Careers advanced by closing PowerPoint risk columns, not by opening new ones. Saying no when something wasn't safe enough meant delays, friction, and awkward performance reviews. Saying yes meant smooth meetings, smiling bosses, and a reputation for being solutions-oriented. In a company that once boasted that every bolt had a reason, people who knew the physics watched people who knew the financials decide which bolts really mattered. His story is one of a great engineering empire drifting into financial engineering, at times inspiring and at times chilling because it shows how slowly and quietly power can move. Meeting by meeting, memo by memo, the center of gravity shifted away from the test pilots and toward the bean counters. And it's an example of what happens when those who understand lift, drag, and failure modes lose arguments to those who understand discount rates and quarterly guidance. When the next plane rolled out to meet the real world, whose calculations would prove correct? Those calculations meant their first real test, not in a wind tunnel or a simulator, but on a stage in Europe. Because while Boeing's executives were arguing over margins and headcount, Airbus stepped out with a simple, brutal announcement. A new twist on its workhorse A320, the A320neo, with engines that would burn dramatically less fuel. Same basic plane, new power plants, up to 15% better fuel efficiency. In an industry where jet fuel is often an airline's single biggest expense, that wasn't a tweak. That was a weapon. There was a time when wide-body giants like the 747 got all the glory, but narrow-body jets quietly built the empire. Single aisle, short to medium haul, flying passengers between Chicago and Dallas, Paris and Rome, Delhi and Dubai, every hour of every day. These planes are the buses of the sky, doing multiple legs, generating money with relentless repetition. Shave even a few % off the fuel burn on each flight and over thousands of cycles. The savings balloon into tens or hundreds of millions. Let me take you back to those first order books. Airline executives, who spent years begging manufacturers for better fuel economics, suddenly saw their dream on a glossy Airbus slide. Same pilot type rating, same basic airframe, but new engines promising to rescue their balance sheets. They did not hesitate. Orders poured in from Lufthansa, AirAsia, Indigo, American, and many more, locking in delivery slots years into the future. For Airbus, it was a masterstroke. Low development cost, high marketing impact, and a direct shot at Boeing's pride and profit center. For Boeing, watching from Seattle and Chicago, it was something closer to a nightmare. The 737 line, stretching back to the 1960s, was the backbone of its commercial empire. If airlines migrated en masse to the A320neo, Boeing wouldn't just lose a few sales. It would lose the commanding position that had underwritten decades of wealth and power. Suddenly, all those internal debates about culture and spreadsheets had an external timer attached. Boeing had two realistic options. Option 1, design an all-new narrow-body airplane, a clean-sheet jet optimized from nose to tail for modern engines, composite materials, and updated safety philosophies. Safer margins, better performance, but a long, expensive development cycle and a painful gap in the market while Airbus racked up orders. Option 2, do what Airbus had just done, but faster and cheaper. Take the aging 737 platform, stretch and tweak it yet again, bolt on larger, more efficient engines, and rush a new model to market while promising airlines minimal disruption. Same family, same pilot type rating, no costly simulator time. On paper, it meant speed, continuity, and happy shareholders. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this was capitalism on a countdown clock. Wall Street wanted reassurance. Airline CEOs wanted guarantees. Engineers wanted time. In the conference rooms where those voices collided, a pivotal decision took shape: chase speed and cost on an old airframe, or gamble billions on a safer, cleaner future. The world would soon find out which instinct won. Boeing had a choice: reinvent its workhorse or keep squeezing money from an aging frame. It chose the second path, and that decision started with metal, geometry, and a design frozen in a very different era of aviation. Let me take you back to the late 1960s. There was a time when the 737 was the scrappy newcomer, built for short hops, small airports, and tight budgets. To make boarding faster at out-of-the-way fields with no fancy jet bridges, engineers gave it short landing gear and a low-slung body hugging the tarmac. That worked perfectly with the stubby, cigar-shaped engines of the day, which tucked neatly under the wing like round suitcases under a bed. Decades later, the empire of jet travel had changed. Airlines wanted more range, less fuel burn, more passengers, and more profit on every leg. Airbus answered with the A320neo and its big, high bypass engines, squeezing extra wealth out of every gallon of fuel. Boeing's customers wanted the same advantage, but they wanted it on a 737. On paper, it sounded simple. Take the old airframe, bolt on new, larger engines, and watch the efficiency gains roll in. There was just one problem. Those new engines were too big for the 737's short legs. If Boeing hung them in the traditional spot, the fan casings would almost kiss the runway. So engineers did something subtle, and at the time, clever. They slid the engines forward and up, reshaping the nacelles into a flattened, almost smiling oval on the bottom. From a distance, it still looked like a 737. Up close, the proportions had changed. That shift wasn't cosmetic. Moving a heavy engine changes the way air flows around the wing and the way forces act on the nose. At high angles of attack, when the plane's nose is pitched up and the wing is biting hard into the air, the new engine placement added lift ahead of the wing and created extra leverage to raise the nose even more. The very modification that saved fuel also quietly increased the plane's tendency to pitch up. Why does that matter? Because a stronger pitch-up tendency nudges the aircraft closer to an aerodynamic stall in certain corners of its flight envelope, especially in aggressive climbs or tight turns. Regulators live in those corners. Test pilots hunt for them. Any hint that the new 737 behaved differently from the old one threatened the promise Boeing had sold. A seamless transition, no expensive simulator time, no disruption to airline training pipelines or their carefully tuned money machines. So instead of rebuilding the airframe, Boeing made a different choice. It would teach the airplane to pretend it still flew like the old 737, not by reshaping aluminum, but by quietly rewriting its brain. That hidden lesson would soon get a name and a terrifying real-world exam. That hidden lesson would be written into a quiet piece of code with an innocuous name, MCAS. On paper, it sounded almost boring. A background helper, a digital hand on the yoke that would only nudge the plane when things got a little too wild. MCAS stood for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, which is a long way of saying this. Software that watches how steeply the nose is pointed, and if it thinks the jet is pitching up too much, it automatically pushes the nose down. No drama, no warning lights, no big speech to the pilots. Just a trim command here, a trim command there, like a ghost reaching into the cockpit and giving the wheel a subtle shove. There was a time when Boeing bragged that every control, every cable, every bolt had a clear mechanical logic. With the 737 MAX, the logic was financial. Boeing's goal was simple and ruthless: make this new, heavier, re-engined airplane feel to pilots like the old 737 they already knew, so airlines could keep the same type rating, avoid expensive simulator sessions, and protect their carefully planned flows of money and training time. If the jet handled the same, the sales team could promise airlines a modern engine bolted onto a familiar life, with none of the cost or hassle that usually comes with a new design. But the new engines changed how the plane behaved at high angles of attack. To mask that, engineers gave MCAS real power. When it sensed the nose rising too far, it would drive the horizontal stabilizer, trimming nose down to push the jet back toward level flight. Not once, repeatedly. Each time it thought the danger persisted, it would add more nose-down trim, stronger than the pilot's own pull on the column. Here is where the story turns from clever to chilling. MCAS depended on a single angle of attack sensor mounted on the outside of the jet, a small vane measuring the wind's bite against the nose. These sensors can and do fail. Birds hit them. Maintenance misaligns them, electronics glitch. Redundancy is aviation's religion. 2 engines, multiple hydraulic systems, backup instruments. Yet this software guardian, with the power to drive the airplane's nose toward the ground, listened to just one sensor and ignored the other. Worse, most MAX pilots were never fully told what MCAS could do. The system was buried in manuals, left out of training, treated as a background detail rather than a central character in the plane's behavior. So when that single sensor spat out nonsense, MCAS woke up, believed every word, and began trimming the nose down again and again, while crews fought a force they didn't even know by name. How did a system with that much authority over the aircraft's attitude get approved with so little transparency and redundancy? To answer that, let me take you back to the first time MCAS misread the sky and turned a routine climb into a desperate, losing battle. The first time MCAS misread the sky, it didn't start with software. It started with a small metal vane on the side of the nose, spinning in the wind, quietly telling the computer what up meant. That vane was the angle of attack sensor, a device that cost less than a nice airport sandwich, yet now held the power to command the entire aircraft's attitude. There was a time when a part like that would have been treated as just one voice in a noisy chorus of instruments. Cross-checked, backed up, doubted by design. On the 737 MAX, that $2 sensor became a single point of truth. If it was miscalibrated, if a bird hit it, if a mechanic installed it a few degrees off, MCAS would see a phantom stall, grab the stabilizer, and start driving the nose toward the ground while pilots fought to pull it back. Redundancy was not a new idea. Other Boeing jets compared multiple angle of attack sensors, used voting logic, and threw out the odd one. Airbus jets did the same. A second sensor, a few extra lines of code, a cross-check that said, "These readings don't match, stand down." The money involved was pocket change next to the hundreds of millions poured into marketing the MAX as no new training required. Yet that tiny saving, multiplied across an empire of orders, was guarded like treasure. Inside Boeing, engineers noticed. Internal documents and emails later revealed debates over whether MCAS should read from both sensors, whether it should be limited, whether flight crews should be told more. Some argued that relying on a single input for a system with that much authority violated the company's own safety philosophy. Others, higher up the chain, worried that changing MCAS behavior or adding alerts might trigger new simulator requirements, new FAA questions, new delays in the race against Airbus. Because of that pressure, design decisions took on a strange moral weight. A backup sensor wasn't just a backup, it was a potential schedule slip. A new warning wasn't just extra safety, it was an admission that the MAX did not fly just like the old 737. And when money, power, and market share are on the line, the quiet voice saying, "This is risky," can be drowned out by the louder one saying, "We'll handle it later." It's an example of what happens when financial engineering starts to outrank real engineering. Then comes the uncomfortable pattern interrupt. The same company that once bragged every bolt had a reason now put a single unvoted sensor in charge of a system that could repeatedly override human hands. His story is one of technical brilliance and, at times inspiring and at times chilling, cost-cutting. How did a business that built its life on safety margins finally convince itself that one fragile vane in the wind was enough? There was a time when Boeing's sales pitch sounded almost comforting. Airlines were told the 737 MAX wasn't a new airplane at all, just the same trusty workhorse with a little more fuel efficiency, a little more range, and crucially, no need to spend millions on pilot retraining. Same type rating, same feel, same cockpit. To an industry obsessed with margins, that promise was pure money. Because that one promise carried enormous power, it quietly became the cage around the entire design. Any change that might force simulator time threatened the business case, the marketing story, the empire Boeing was trying to defend against Airbus. So engineers weren't just asked to solve aerodynamic problems, they were asked to solve them without leaving fingerprints, without triggering a single extra training requirement. It wasn't enough to make the plane safe. It had to be safe while looking, on paper, almost identical. Let me take you back to the sales brochures and glossy presentations. Boeing assured airline executives that pilots who could fly a 737NG could step into the MAX after a brief iPad course, maybe an hour or two of computer-based training. No expensive simulator slots, no days pulled off the line, no union fights over new qualifications. That was the hook used to close billion-dollar deals, to promise that upgrading a fleet would feel more like a software update than a new airplane entering service. Inside the company, that marketing line hardened into a ruthless constraint. When the bigger, repositioned engines changed how the plane felt at high angles of attack, MCAS became the invisible glue to hold the story together. Instead of saying, "This flies differently, you need to learn it," Boeing chose, "This flies the same, the computer will handle it, and no one needs to talk about it." It's an example of what happens when a slogan starts to dictate engineering rather than the other way around. That logic spread into manuals and training. On many airlines, MCAS was not named in the flight crew operating manual. It appeared, if at all, as a vague reference inside broader pitch stability language, buried in technical sections pilots rarely saw in day-to-day life. The system that could move the tail and drive the nose toward the ground was treated like a footnote. No dedicated module, no dramatic call-out, no simulator scenario where crews practiced fighting a runaway. Behind the scenes, employees knew exactly what was at stake. Internal messages later revealed staff bragging that they had convinced regulators that no simulator training was required, joking that they wouldn't let their own families fly on the MAX, and describing the plane as designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. Simulator time wasn't just a training tool, it was a financial threat, a potential confession that the same airplane story was a lie. So pilots walked up the jet bridge believing they were flying a familiar machine, another link in a long, safe lineage. What they actually met was a different reality, an old airframe stretched to its limits, managed by a secretive system tied to a single sensor that, under the wrong conditions, could quietly seize control. The next part of the story begins when that fragile arrangement finally met real-world chaos. That chaos didn't just expose a flawed airplane, it exposed a system that was supposed to catch those flaws and instead waved them through. There was a time when the Federal Aviation Administration was seen as the stern referee of American aviation. By the time the 737 MAX arrived, that referee had quietly handed the whistle to the home team. Let me take you back to the mechanism that made that possible. Organization Designation Authorization, or ODA. On paper, it sounded efficient. The FAA would delegate certain certification tasks to engineers inside companies like Boeing, allowing them to sign off on designs as if they were the regulator. In reality, it meant that the people building the empire were also stamping the safety approvals, all while sitting at the same desks, under the same managers, with the same quarterly targets. Because of decades of budget cuts, hiring freezes, and relentless industry lobbying, the FAA's own technical brain shrank. Fewer inspectors, fewer specialists, more airplanes, more complexity. The agency leaned harder on manufacturers, asking them to do more analysis, more testing, more documentation in-house. It saved the government money. It gave Boeing more power. It also meant that at times inspiring and at times chilling, the line between watchdog and partner almost disappeared. Inside Boeing, the conflict of interest was not theoretical. ODA unit members were paid by Boeing, promoted by Boeing, and evaluated by Boeing managers whose bonuses depended on keeping schedules intact and costs under control. Say yes, and the program moved. Say no too often, and a career could quietly stall. It's an example of what happens when the referee's paycheck depends on the score. MCAS slipped right into that gray zone. Early on, some delegated engineers and internal reviewers did question its power and failure modes, how much nose-down authority it had, how many times it could trigger, what would happen if a single angle of attack sensor went bad. But as the design evolved, those concerns were sanded down, reworded, or buried in dense report that never fully lit up red on the FAA's external radar. Key details about MCAS's expanding authority were not clearly flagged to the agency's own staff. The system migrated from a narrow, high-speed corner of the flight envelope to much broader conditions. Its potential to repeatedly drive the nose down increased. Yet the public-facing message to regulators and airlines stayed soothing. The MAX behaved like any other 737, no special simulator training, minimal paperwork, same familiar story. When some FAA engineers finally saw more complete data, it was late in the game, with production already moving and delivery slots sold. Internal risk assessments were performed, assumptions were made about pilot reactions, and the program kept marching. The watchdog, overwhelmed and underfunded, accepted the reassurances of the very engineers whose work was on trial. By the time passengers walked down those jet bridges, the unsettling truth was set in metal and code. The leash had been passed to Boeing. The question that remained unasked in public was what would happen the first time MCAS met a bad sensor, a dark cockpit, and a crew that had never been told the full story. Then, without warning, the story jumps from metal and code to something far more unsettling. The words of the people inside the empire who built it. There was a time when Boeing's image rested on quiet, methodical engineers in white shirts, arguing over rivets and redundancy. Now, regulators and the public were reading messages from those same halls that sounded less like a temple of safety and more like a burned-out group chat. In one internal email, a pilot-turned-manager looked at the 737 MAX program and called it what he thought it had become: a joke. Let me take you back to 2016 and 2017, before the crashes, before the headlines, when the money was still flowing and the MAX was being sold as the future. Inside Boeing systems, employees were venting. One wrote, "This airplane is designed by clowns who are in turn supervised by monkeys. It landed like a punch because it stripped away the corporate slogans and showed something raw: contempt for leadership, disbelief in the process, and a morale so corroded that mockery felt safer than whistleblowing." That single line compressed an entire culture shift. Not only did it mock the people at the top, it implied that the people doing the day-to-day work felt powerless, trapped between executives chasing wealth and schedules, and regulators they no longer respected. Because of that ruthless pressure, they joked instead of refused, they coped instead of stopped. It's an example of what happens when an engineering powerhouse spends more time pleasing Wall Street than listening to its own experts. And the jokes did not stop at the airplane. In other messages, employees bragged about how they had convinced regulators that pilots did not need full simulator training for the MAX. One wrote that they had Jedi mind-tricked officials into accepting iPad lessons and minimal differences training. Another scoffed that no simulator would ever be needed. The tone was casual, even playful, as if nudging the FAA into a cheaper path was just another clever move in a game. But this was not a game. Those messages undercut the polished post-crash narrative that the problems were unforeseen, that this was an unlucky chain of technical glitches. Here were people inside the program acknowledging shortcuts, laughing about the very training that might have given crews a fighting chance when MCAS misfired. The life and death stakes were invisible in the banter, and that absence says as much as any technical report. Suddenly, the story is no longer about abstract systems failing in the dark. It is about human beings under pressure, aware that something was deeply wrong, yet talking about it like a bad office joke. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the history of Boeing's rise from wartime hero to commercial giant had always been framed as a story of progress. These emails forced a harsher question. What happens when the people inside the cockpit of power start to lose faith in the controls? Because those private words were now public, and the next thing to go on trial would not just be a software system, but an entire way of doing business. Those private words had barely finished echoing through boardrooms and newsrooms when the world received a far more brutal message. Not an email this time, but a plume of smoke and a scatter of metal over dark water. Let me take you back to the early morning of October 29th, 2018. Jakarta, just after sunrise. Humid air, low clouds, the usual chaos of scooters and traffic outside. Inside Soekarno-Hatta Airport, Lion Air Flight 610, a relatively new 737 MAX 8, waited at the gate. Passengers shuffled down the jet bridge, checking phones, juggling bags, thinking about work, family, money, the day ahead. No one knew that buried in the avionics bay, beneath their feet, was a piece of software they'd never heard of, wired to a single sensor that could decide the fate of the entire flight. There was a time when Boeing sold planes on the promise that pilots were always in charge. On this morning, that promise was about to be tested. As the MAX rolled down the runway, everything looked routine. Throttles forward, engines roared. The aircraft accelerated over the concrete and lifted cleanly into the Indonesian sky. But seconds after liftoff, one of the angle of attack vanes on the nose began feeding the computers a lie, telling the jet it was climbing at a dangerously steep angle. Inside the cockpit, the captain's control column started to shake violently. The stick shaker, a primal warning that the wing is about to stall, rattled non-stop on his side. On the first officer's side, nothing. One pilot seeing a life or death alarm, the other seeing a normal climb. Airspeed indicators disagreed. Altitude tapes didn't match. This was not a gentle introduction to a new airplane. This was chaos at 3,000 feet. Because of that faulty sensor, MCAS quietly woke up. No chime, no voice, no friendly message. The stabilizer in the tail began to trim nose down, slowly forcing the aircraft to lower its head. The captain pulled back on the yoke, re-trimmed up, fought for level flight. For a few seconds, it worked. Then MCAS triggered again, nose down. Manual trim, nose down, manual trim. A hidden tug of war between human hands and unseen code. The pilots had never been told that MCAS even existed. Their manuals barely mentioned it. Their training sold the MAX as just another 737, a familiar machine in a long corporate life of incremental upgrades. Yet here they were, wrestling a system that could move the tail with more power than their own arms. For 11 minutes they struggled. The captain asked for airspeed, altitude, help. The first officer flipped through checklists, searching for a name, a procedure, something that matched the madness playing out on the screens. At times inspiring, and at times chilling, their effort kept the jet from diving straight into the sea more than once, clawing back altitude, only to have MCAS shove the nose down again. Finally, with the trim wound far forward and the jet accelerating, the forces on the control column grew overwhelming. The nose dropped, the descent steepened, and Lion Air 610 plunged into the Java Sea at high speed, killing all 189 people on board. Rescue boats found debris, life vests, fragments of an empire of modern aviation scattered over the water. Investigators were left with a puzzle of sensors, software, and silence. A single misreading vane, a system designed to act on that one input. No redundancy, minimal documentation, and crews kept in the dark to protect the promise of no new simulator training. It's an example of what happens when power quietly shifts from pilots to algorithms, while a company tells regulators and airlines that nothing important has changed. This was not a random failure. It was the first loud alarm that something in the MCAS' design, certification, and training philosophy had gone terribly wrong. And yet, even as families mourned and questions mounted, the planes kept flying, setting the stage for a second tragedy that would make denial impossible. So when the Lion Air 737 MAX hit the Java Sea in October 2018, it was not just a crash, it was a question mark slammed into the ocean. What could bring down a brand new jet from the world's most famous plane maker on a clear morning, minutes after takeoff? Let me take you back to the search ship circling over choppy water, sonar pinging, divers dropping into the dark. Within days, they pulled up the bright orange flight data recorder, the black box that doesn't care about press releases or reputations. Investigators downloaded its memory and reconstructed the final flights frame by frame. What emerged was a pattern, not a fluke. On the accident flight and the one before it, a hidden system kept waking up, again and again forcing the nose down. That system was MCAS. Every time it activated, it pushed the nose toward the sea for 10 seconds at a time, then paused, then tried again, like a relentless metronome of bad logic. The data showed pilots pulling back on their controls, adding power, fighting to keep the jet climbing, while MCAS quietly read a single angle of attack sensor that insisted the plane was on the edge of a stall. The sensor was wrong. MCAS didn't know or didn't care. There was a time when Boeing bragged that every critical input on a jet had redundancy, backups for backups, because lives depended on it. On the MAX, this new software was allowed to trust one vane on the side of the nose, a piece of hardware worth less than a nice family dinner, and treat its reading as absolute truth. Worse, the data showed that this particular sensor had been miscalibrated when it was installed the day before the crash. Investigators traced it back through maintenance logs. The replacement sensor came from a repair shop, passed through quality checks, and was bolted onto the jet in Jakarta. No proper calibration on the airframe, incomplete documentation, a test flight that showed problems but ended without clear resolution. The plane went back into service anyway. Money was saved, the schedule was kept, the empire of on-time departures rolled on. His story is one of engineering pride. This story is one of engineering assumptions. Lion Air's maintenance practices were uneven, its pilot training criticized, its internal controls questioned. Investigators acknowledged all of that, yet the core horror remained. A single bad sensor could repeatedly override human hands, trimming the stabilizer nose down over and over, while the crew, never fully briefed on MCAS, tried to make sense of a machine that felt possessed. Because of that design, the crash was not just about one airline in Indonesia, but about a philosophy. And yet, in the first weeks, Boeing's public stance leaned heavily on airline maintenance, pilot response, and local training. MCAS was mentioned politely, framed as a background helper, not the star of the show. The narrative was clear. This was an outlier, not a systemic warning. The response matched that framing. Boeing issued bulletins reminding pilots how to handle runaway stabilizer. Airlines updated checklists. Regulators nodded. No major redesign of MCAS. No global simulator training mandate. The MAX kept flying worldwide, even as that black box data sat on investigators' screens, at times inspiring and at times chilling. It's an example of what happens when a warning is treated as a public relations problem rather than a design emergency. Because while the world moved on, another MAX was already taxiing toward the runway in Ethiopia, carrying families, wealth, and the illusion that everything had finally been understood. But let me take you back to the day before that first Lion Air jet hit the water, because there was a time when the same airplane, with the same hidden system, tried to go down and failed. It was October 28th, 2018. The jet that would later be known to the world as Flight 610 lifted off from Bali as Lion Air Flight 043. Different flight number, different crew, same machine. Almost immediately, the nose began to misbehave, pitching down in sharp, unnerving bursts. The captain pulled back, trimmed up, the nose settled. And then, moments later, the invisible hand pushed again. In the jump seat behind them sat an off-duty Lion Air pilot, dead heading home. He wasn't on the schedule to save a life that day. He was just hitching a ride. But as the crew fought the controls, wrestling a plane that kept trying to dive toward the sea, he recognized a pattern that felt eerily like runaway stabilizer trim, a problem older than any software empire Boeing had built. He leaned forward and told them to do something very simple, very old school, and very decisive. Reach down between the seats, grab the stabilizer trim, cut out switches, and flip them off. In that instant, the electric motor that MCAS used to drive the tail stopped. The nose-down commands went silent. Manual control returned. The flight leveled. They had just neutralized MCAS without knowing its name, without a single mention of it in their manuals, with no warning that a new, more aggressive system was now wired into the heart of their aircraft's behavior. To them, it was a familiar drill from 737 training. When the trim runs away, you kill the power and fly the airplane. Old procedure, new cause. The jet landed safely in Jakarta. Passengers walked off, checked their phones, complained about delays, went home to their families. On paper, it was a technical issue that had been handled by the crew. In reality, it was an example of what happens when a design flaw collides with human experience, and for one day, human experience wins, because that near miss should have been a blaring siren. Same aircraft, severe flight control problem, a crew forced to cut out the stabilizer just to keep the nose from driving down. This was not turbulence. This was not a minor glitch. This was the airplane fighting its own pilots. Yet, in the hours that followed, the jet was checked, written up, signed off, and cleared. The underlying software logic, the single sensor dependence, the missing training, all remained. Boeing knew it had added MCAS. Regulators knew this was a brand new variant sold on the promise of no new simulator time. Everyone was now on notice that something was wrong, and still the system marched on. One flight saved, one flight lost, separated by less than 24 hours and a few signatures on maintenance forms. So the question hangs in the air. When a company and its regulators get a rehearsal for disaster and watch the curtain fall without casualties, why does nobody slam on the brakes before the next act begins? So let me take you back to another morning when the curtain rose again. March 10th, 2019, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Just after sunrise, the light is clean and sharp, the sky clear, the air thin at 7,600 feet above sea level. On the ramp sits Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, a nearly new 737 MAX 8 delivered just months earlier, painted in the colors of one of Africa's proudest carriers. This is not a struggling outfit on the margins. Ethiopian is respected, expanding, an empire in the making on the continent's airways. In the cockpit, Captain Yared Getachew and First Officer Ahmed Nur Mohammed. Trained, professional, flying a route to Nairobi that should be routine. There was a time when a brand new Boeing with a seasoned crew was the safest combination money could buy. Passengers buckle in, phones go to airplane mode, and the jet accelerates down the runway. Almost immediately after liftoff, the calm shatters. The left seat stick shaker slams to life, rattling violently as if trying to tear itself off the column. Altitude and airspeed disagree, jumping on the screens. The captain pulls back, climbing, but the computers insist something is wrong. Then, once again, a hidden line of code wakes up. MCAS reads a single faulty angle of attack sensor and decides the nose is too high. It quietly commands nose down trim. The jet, already heavy and climbing out of a high-altitude airport, starts to pitch toward the ground. The crew counter-trims. MCAS returns, nose down, nose up, nose down again. A silent tug-of-war between humans and software, playing out in seconds, hundreds of feet above the ground. After Lion Air, Boeing had told airlines that if MCAS misbehaved, pilots should treat it as a runaway stabilizer, cut out the trim switches, use the manual trim wheel, fly the plane. Ethiopian's crew had that bulletin. They knew the drill on paper. But paper doesn't weigh 180,000 pounds and hurtle forward at over 300 miles per hour. As the jet accelerates, the aerodynamic forces on the tail grow brutal. The manual trim wheel that worked in the simulator now fights back in real life, almost frozen. The crew is low, fast, bombarded with warnings. They try to climb, they toggle trim, they talk to the tower, they wrestle a machine whose own software keeps trying to bury its nose. Altitude runs out long before their training does. The impact 6 minutes after takeoff carves a crater into the Ethiopian soil. No survivors. Another nearly new 737 MAX. Another respected crew. Another flight that never reaches cruise. The similarities are eerie, at times inspiring and at times chilling in their precision. A single sensor failure, repeated MCAS activations, pilots fighting, a system they were never fully briefed on, never trained for in a simulator, because that would have cost too much and broken the same old 737 marketing story. One crash can be framed as tragedy. Two, in less than 5 months, start to look like design. It's an example of what happens when a safety net is stretched until the same hole appears in the same place, twice. This time, the world pays attention. Regulators from China to Europe begin grounding the MAX. Families demand answers. Headlines ask whether Boeing's crown jewel narrow body, the workhorse that prints so much wealth, is actually safe to fly at all. And as those jets sit parked on tarmacs around the globe, engines silent, another question begins to surface. If the pattern is this obvious from the outside, what did people on the inside already know? From that moment, the world stops waiting for answers from Chicago and in Washington and starts acting on its own. Within hours of the Ethiopian crash, regulators in China, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and dozens of other countries begin to ground the 737 MAX, one by one, like runway lights shutting off in sequence. There was a time when everyone else took their cues from the United States. The FAA was the gold standard, the grown-up in the room, the agency other nations copied when they wrote their own rules. Now, let me take you back to that week in March 2019, when the script flips. China, often portrayed as playing catch-up in aviation, becomes the first major authority to ban the MAX. Europe's EASA follows. Canada hesitates, then moves. Even tiny aviation agencies with a handful of inspectors declare the plane unsafe to fly. And the FAA, it insists the jet is airworthy. Boeing issues press statements defending the MAX, talking about data, probabilities, and a proven design. Executives in suits stand behind podiums, assuring the public that the plane is safe, that there is no basis to ground it, even as departure boards across the globe quietly lose 3 letters, MAX. The symbolism is brutal. Because of years of perceived regulatory capture and cozy delegation to Boeing, The FAA watches its authority drain away in real time. Countries that once deferred to American power now lead the charge, pointing without saying it out loud to a simple conclusion: if the US won't protect passengers, they will. It's an example of what happens when an empire of trust is spent down for short-term money and convenience. On the ground, the economic shock hits fast. Airlines scramble to reshuffle fleets, canceling hundreds of flights, wet leasing older jets, dragging retired aircraft back into service. Passengers refuse rebookings on the MAX, searching seat maps, calling hotlines, asking gate agents what kind of plane is at the gate. For Boeing, the proud maker of the 707 and the 747, the MAX had been the crown jewel, the best-selling narrow body in its history. Overnight, it becomes a stranded asset, billions in wealth locked up in aluminum and software that no one is allowed to use. Inside Boeing's press rooms, the tone stays confident, almost serene. Charts are shown, safety records are cited. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the performance feels less like crisis management and more like denial. The FAA echoes the talking points, then, under overwhelming international pressure and fresh satellite data, finally reverses course and grounds the fleet. The supposed leader has been dragged to the finish line by its followers. Months later, the visual legacy of that week is impossible to ignore. Hundreds of 737 MAX jets parked wingtip to wingtip in desert storage, rows of identical white fuselages baking in the sun, engines capped, windows dark. It looks like a graveyard for a dream, a frozen snapshot of a broken system. And as those planes sit silently accumulating dust, investigators begin prying into internal emails and design decisions, uncovering a trail that points far beyond a single software glitch. But while investigators dig through emails and flight data, something else is happening far from the cameras. In a glassy auditorium on Boeing's campus, the empire is trying to hold itself together. Rows of employees in blue Boeing jackets, badges swinging, fill the seats. On stage, under soft corporate lighting, leadership lines up behind a lectern, as if this is just another quarterly update. It is not. Everyone in that room knows the company's reputation is on fire. There was a time when working at Boeing meant automatic bragging rights at family dinners, when the name stood for engineering excellence, the way Rockefellers once stood for oil. Now people's relatives are sending them news clips, asking the same quiet question: what happened? The CEO starts with the script: commitment to safety, deep sorrow for the families, absolute confidence in the 737 MAX. He talks about enhancing the software, about a simple MCAS update that will be rolled out quickly, about how the plane is fundamentally safe. Each phrase is polished, tested, legal reviewed. Each phrase is supposed to calm markets, regulators, and the people sitting right in front of him. Let me take you back to the talking points. The MAX will be one of the safest airplanes in the sky. The company is partnering closely with the FAA. Pilots will receive additional training materials. This is framed as a tragic but manageable setback, not a crisis of design, culture, and power. It's an example of what happens when a company learns to talk like a bank while still pretending to build like an engineering shop. But the faces in the audience tell a different story. These are people who have lived the cost-cutting, the schedule pressure, the relentless focus on quarterly money targets. They remember when McDonnell Douglas executives arrived and the conversation shifted from margins of safety to margins of profit. They remember rushed reviews, waived tests, warnings that went nowhere. His story is one of spreadsheets. Theirs is one of sleepless nights on the factory floor. Then comes the pattern break. A hand goes up from a structures engineer in a faded fleece. The microphone shakes a little. You talk about safety as our top priority, he says. But for years, we've been told to hit schedule, hit cost, hit delivery. What changes now, concretely, in how we design and how we say no? The room goes very still. A line worker from the 737 line asks whether independent oversight will actually increase, or if this is just more PowerPoint. Another employee, voice flat, asks the question that cuts through every slogan. Would you let your own family fly the MAX tomorrow? On stage, the answers are smooth. Yes, absolutely. The leadership would have full confidence putting loved ones on the airplane once the update is in place. Culture is always evolving. Concerns are heard. Words that sound reassuring on CNBC land differently here, in a room full of people who know how often red flags have been filed, forwarded, and forgotten. Because these employees have seen internal messages mocking regulators, heard colleagues joke that the jet was designed by clowns supervised by monkeys, watched safety engineers get sidelined by program managers with delivery charts. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the town hall becomes a mirror. On one side, the official narrative, on the other, the lived reality of a workforce, realizing that the company's greatest risk may not be a sensor or a line of code, but the culture that produced both. And as the executives step off stage to polite, thin applause, the real question hanging in the air is not about software timelines at all, but whether an empire built on engineering pride can survive after its own people stop believing the story. There was a time when the loudest voices inside Boeing were the engineers who said no. No to shortcuts. No to unexplained anomalies. No to anything that might threaten the life of a passenger who would never know their name. By the time the 737 MAX entered service, many of those voices were either gone, sidelined, or learning the cost of saying that word too often. Let me take you back to a cramped conference room in Renton, where a veteran engineer warned that bolting larger engines onto an aging airframe without fully rethinking its behavior was gambling with physics. He questioned MCAS, questioned the single sensor, questioned the rush. On paper, Boeing celebrated this kind of pushback. In practice, he was quietly moved off the program, his influence reduced to comments in documents that could be resolved with a keystroke. His story is one of many. A quality inspector flagged repeated issues on 737 production lines, foreign object debris left in wings, rushed inspections, sign-offs done from a distance because schedule was king. A manager raised alarms that employees were being pushed to meet deadlines first and verify safety later. Each expected the company to rally around them. Instead, they watched promotions evaporate, performance reviews cool, and invitations to key meetings mysteriously stop arriving. Because of this internal climate, raising a safety concern became an act with a price tag. Not a dramatic firing in most cases, but something slower and at times inspiring and at times chilling. The stalled career, the sideways transfer, the subtle whisper that this person was not a team player. In a business where money, status, and future projects flow through a small circle of decision makers, that whisper could be as lethal to a career as any official reprimand. It's an example of what happens when a company's empire shifts from engineering excellence to financial performance. People who once wore guardian of safety as a badge of honor were reframed as obstacles, the human equivalent of a delay in the Gantt chart. In meeting after meeting, the question quietly flipped from, "Is this safe enough?" to "Will this keep us on schedule?" And anyone who slowed the march toward market was treated as a problem to be managed. After the crashes, some of those same problems walked into congressional hearings and media studios with folders of emails, memos, and certification documents. Messages where employees called the MAX a joke mocked regulators and admitted they wouldn't let their own families fly on the plane suddenly became front-page evidence of a deeper rot. Testimony from sidelined engineers and inspectors helped investigators reconstruct how warnings had been raised, acknowledged, and then buried under layers of process. Because of their courage, the world finally saw that the disaster was not just about a sensor or a line of code, but about an organization that had treated red flags as annoyances. Yet the moral tension remains. In a company whose products carry hundreds of lives at a time, what happens when the people who dare to say stop are the ones escorted out of the room, while the people who say go keep climbing? The answer to that question would soon play out not only in hearings and headlines, but in courtrooms and balance sheets, as Boeing's pursuit of wealth collided with the full weight of legal and public judgment. That collision didn't just happen in court filings and quarterly reports. It walked into the bright lights of Congress, sat down under oath, and stared into cameras that were broadcasting around the world. There was a time when Boeing executives were treated almost like national heroes, guardians of an empire of flight that connected cities, families, and fortunes. Now their CEO sat at a long green table, flanked by lawyers and binders, while behind him, row after row of grieving parents, spouses, and children held up photographs of the dead. The room was thick with silence, the kind that makes even powerful people look very small. Lawmakers went straight for the heart of the story, MCAS, the single angle of attack sensor, the decision to hide a powerful new system inside an old familiar cockpit and still call it the same airplane. One senator held up a blown-up diagram of the 737 MAX flight controls and asked, in a perfectly calm voice, why a multi-million-dollar jet depended on a lone sensor that cost less than a nice dinner in DC. The answer, buried under jargon about failure modes and rare scenarios, never quite landed. When FAA officials took the hot seat, the narrative twisted again. They described a partnership with Boeing, a delegation system, a shared mission of safety. Then internal emails surfaced on the screens behind them, where Boeing employees mocked regulators, joked about clowns supervised by monkeys, and admitted they wouldn't put their own families on the MAX simulators. The contrast was brutal. On paper, a safety alliance. In private, a relationship that looked at times inspiring and at times chilling. Boeing's leadership framed the crashes as tragic, but fixable. A software patch, better training, clearer manuals. His story is one of a disciplined, data-driven company that had simply misjudged a system and would now correct it. But the documents told a different life. Managers pressuring engineers, schedules beating out caution, and a regulator so intertwined with the company that oversight started to look like a polite suggestion. Then came the moments that cut through every prepared talking point. A father stepped to the witness table, set down a framed photo of his daughter, and asked the CEO to say her name into the microphone. A mother held up a tiny pair of shoes and asked which spreadsheet had decided her child was an acceptable risk. Let me take you back to those faces for a second, because they turned abstract words like risk profile and rate per million flight hours into a single, unbearable question. What is a human life worth compared to a delivery deadline and a Wall Street forecast? Executives apologized. Regulators promised reform. New committees, new audits, new training. On paper, it sounded like closure. Yet, as the cameras clicked off and the room emptied, one doubt lingered in the air. If the same money, the same power, and the same incentives stayed in place, what would really change the next time a company's wealth was on a collision course with human lives? The answer to that would emerge not in speeches, but in what Boeing quietly did next. The answer to that would emerge not in speeches, but in spreadsheets. In quiet conference rooms, far from cameras and grieving families. Another language rules: columns, probabilities, dollar signs. This is where human life is translated into cells on a screen, and where a company decides how much safety it can afford. There was a time when this way of thinking felt shocking. Then it became standard practice. Large corporations do it constantly. Estimate how often something might fail, multiply by how many people could die, assign each life a dollar value, then compare that total to the cost of fixing the problem. If the fix is more expensive than the projected payouts, the fix quietly dies. On paper, it looks rational. In real life, it can be ruthless. Let me take you back to the 1970s, to a car called the Ford Pinto. Ford engineers knew the fuel tank could explode in rear-end collisions. Internal memos ran the numbers. A repair might cost $11 per car. The projected cost of burn deaths, injuries, and lawsuits, less than the total cost of the redesign. The company chose not to fix it. That memo, once exposed, became infamous because it showed in black and white how a corporation had calmly priced out human lives and decided they were a bad investment. That Pinto memo is not an anomaly. It is an example of what happens when risk becomes just another line item. Airlines, automakers, drug companies, they all use cost-benefit models. Many times, those models genuinely improve safety by revealing which fixes save the most lives for the least money. But the same tools that can save lives can also be twisted when the pressure for profit, for market share, for quarterly gains overwhelms the quiet voice asking, should this even be a question? So step back from Boeing for a moment and ask, was similar thinking at work here? The cost of redesigning hardware versus bolting new engines onto an aging airframe. The cost of simulator training for thousands of pilots versus a promise that the new jet flew just like the old one. The cost of delays and lost sales versus the perceived low probability of a catastrophic failure in a complex system. On a spreadsheet, those trade-offs can look clean. In the sky, they are anything but. Risk models have a weakness that rarely shows up in the cell formulas. They are built on the past, on averages, on what usually happens. Rare but catastrophic events, the ones that kill hundreds in a single morning, get smoothed out into tiny probabilities. In a simple product, that might be tolerable. In a modern airliner, a flying web of software, sensors, and human reactions, the tail risks are where the real danger lives. And here is the unsettling part. This is not just Boeing's story. His story is one of planes and pilots, but the logic behind it touches almost every product in daily life. The airbags in a family car, the medication in a bathroom cabinet, the batteries in a phone, all pass through someone's cost-benefit filter. Somewhere, a team asked, how much risk will people accept if it keeps the money flowing and the empire growing? At times inspiring, and at times chilling, this spreadsheet view of life raises a final question that no quarterly report can answer. When the numbers say proceed, but common sense says stop, who wins? To see how that played out inside Boeing, the story has to go back into the emails, the test flights, and the quiet decisions that turned theoretical risk into real-world tragedy. Those quiet decisions didn't just play out in cockpits and control rooms. They eventually landed in a federal courtroom, with Boeing facing the full weight of the United States Department of Justice. On paper, it looked like a reckoning. A $2.5 billion deal, a criminal charge, and a promise that the empire of aviation would finally be held to account. Let me take you back to January 2021. The DOJ announced that Boeing would pay more than $2.5 billion to resolve a criminal investigation into the 737 MAX crashes. Not a headline-grabbing civil settlement, a criminal case accusing the company of conspiracy to defraud its own regulator, the FAA. Because of how Boeing had hidden MCAS's true behavior and training implications, prosecutors said, the system that was supposed to protect life had been wrapped in marketing spin and half-truths. The money itself came in 3 carefully labeled buckets. About $1.77 billion was set aside for airline customers, compensating carriers around the world for grounded fleets, lost schedules, and scrambled business plans. Another $500 million went into a fund for the families of the 346 people killed on Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, a pool meant to acknowledge that no amount of money could replace a parent, a child, an entire future. The remaining $243.6 million was the formal criminal penalty, the part that said, in theory, this crossed a line from tragic mistake into prosecutable deception. There was a time when a criminal charge against a flagship manufacturer might have guaranteed a dramatic public trial. Executives on the stand, emails read line by line. Instead, Boeing received a different kind of justice, a deferred prosecution agreement. The company admitted to the conspiracy charge on paper, agreed to improve compliance and safety programs, and promised ongoing cooperation. If it met those conditions for 3 years, the criminal case would be dismissed, as if the indictment itself were just another temporary entry in the ledger. Critics saw the structure and read between the lines. For a company with tens of billions in annual revenue, $2.5 billion hurt, but it did not threaten survival. The airlines were already negotiating their own side deals. The victim fund, while large, averaged out to numbers that felt painfully small when held against an entire life. And no top executive, no board member, no senior program leader faced personal criminal charges. The system blamed the corporation in the abstract, not the humans who had signed off on schedules, budgets, and those now infamous emails. His story is one of ruthless cost control. Theirs became a story of managed accountability. It's an example of what happens when legal risk turns into a line item, when punishment can be forecast in a spreadsheet almost as neatly as quarterly profit. The question that hung over the settlement was simple and chilling. Did this penalty truly change Boeing's culture, or did it quietly teach every large company watching that even the deadliest safety shortcuts can be priced in? To answer that, the story has to follow what happened next, when regulators, Congress, and Boeing's own engineers tried to rebuild trust on a foundation that had already cracked. That cracked foundation wasn't just cultural or regulatory, it was financial. Built plank by plank in boardrooms where safety rarely appeared on the agenda. There was a time when Boeing's proudest metric was the reliability of its planes. By the 2010s, the number everyone watched was the share price. Let me take you back to those years right before the 737 MAX crisis, when Boeing looked unstoppable. Not only was it America's flagship manufacturer, it was a Wall Street darling, showering shareholders with tens of billions of dollars in stock buybacks and dividends. From 2013 to 2019, Boeing spent more repurchasing its own shares than it earned in net income, shrinking the share count, juicing earnings per share, and sending executive stock awards into the stratosphere. On paper, it was a masterclass in turning engineering prestige into cash. But every dollar has an opportunity cost. Money that went into buybacks could have gone into a clean sheet narrow body design to truly answer Airbus's A320neo, instead of bolting larger engines onto a 1960s airframe. It could have funded more simulator time, richer pilot training programs, or redundant sensors and more transparent safety systems. Imagine those billions diverted into wind tunnel campaigns, human factors research, or an internal safety watchdog with real teeth. Instead, much of that wealth flowed out of the company, rewarding short-term holders and the executives whose bonuses depended on them. Because management incentives were tied so tightly to margin targets and stock performance, leadership felt relentless pressure to squeeze more profit out of existing platforms like the 737. Wall Street applauded every quarter where costs were trimmed, schedules were accelerated, and productivity improved. Analysts praised Boeing's disciplined capital allocation, even as engineers complained that the empire was being run by spreadsheets, not by people who lived and breathed aerodynamics. It's an example of what happens when the loudest voice in the room belongs to the market, not the test pilot. On the surface, the strategy worked. Boeing's valuation soared, executives became symbols of modern corporate power, and investors spoke about the company as if it had finally transcended the messy realities of metal, software, and human fallibility. Underneath that glossy story, though, technical debt piled up. Aging designs stretched to their limits. Software band-aids like MCAS layered onto old airframes. A safety culture eroded by fear and deadlines. The more the stock climbed, the harder it became for anyone to question the model without sounding disloyal. And here lies the bitter irony. The very tactics that made Boeing look invincible to markets helped set the stage for one of the most expensive corporate disasters in aviation history, wiping out tens of billions in value, triggering criminal investigations, and scarring families around the world. Yet the real cost wasn't measured in share price, because when those planes finally fell from the sky, the bill for years of financial engineering came due in the harshest currency imaginable. And the next chapter of this story shows who was left holding it. But to understand who really paid, the camera has to move, away from earnings calls and glossy slide decks, down to the concrete floors in Renton and Charleston, where aluminum, wiring, and human hands turned PowerPoint promises into flying machines. There was a time when a mechanic could stop the entire 737 line for a single misrouted cable. Old-timers still talk about it. One of them remembered saying, "If this harness chafes through, somebody's life is on the line," and management would nod, "Pull the plane out, fix it." By the late 2010s, the message had shifted. Don't be the reason we miss rate. Same plane, same hangar, very different empire. On the factory floor, schedule wasn't a number in a spreadsheet. It was a clock on the wall, a supervisor walking faster, overtime sheets stacking up. Mechanics described 12-hour days, 6- and 7-day weeks, pushing jets down the line faster because Wall Street wanted more deliveries, more money, more margin. Panels went on before wiring was fully inspected. Access doors closed with foreign object debris still inside. Tools, drill shavings, plastic caps rolling around where control cables and hydraulic lines lived. One worker recalled finding a forgotten flashlight wedged near a rudder linkage. Another talked about vacuuming metal shavings out of an avionics bay, while a lead reminded him, "We're already behind, don't write up anything that'll hold the aircraft." It's an example of what happens when a company that once bragged every bolt had a purpose starts treating defects as a nuisance to the schedule rather than a warning flare. Inspections, which had been the sacred pause in the life of an airplane, became just another box to check. Inspectors were given more jobs per shift, less time per plane, and a quiet understanding that minor anomalies could be cleared without stopping production. A scratched bracket, a missing clamp, a loosely secured bundle that might vibrate free in 10,000 hours of flight time. None of it looked dramatic in the moment. All of it pushed risk forward onto crews and families who would never see the inside of that fuselage. Yet under the fluorescent lights, pride refused to die. Many of these workers had grown up in Boeing families, with parents who built B-52s, 707s, 747s. His story is one of generational loyalty, grandparents who helped win wars, parents who rode the wave of jet-age wealth, children who thought they were joining the same mission. They still took pictures when their airplane rolled out, still pointed to jets in the sky, and told their kids, "That's ours." And then they'd go back to a workstation where a manager reminded them that raising too many quality flags could impact performance metrics, where questioning a rush job earned a reputation for being not a team player, where the culture on the posters, safety, integrity, quality, felt at times inspiring and at times chilling because it no longer matched the daily reality of overtime, pressure, and quiet shortcuts. Let me take you back to those glossy investor days for a second. While executives talked about record deliveries and free cash flow, some mechanics were emailing regulators, calling hotlines, and warning anyone who would listen that the pace was unsustainable. Their memos didn't make it into the presentations, but their fears did make it into the airplanes. And when the crashes came, many of them watched the news with a sickening mix of horror and recognition, not because they knew the exact failure chain, but because they had felt the direction of travel. The next part of this story shows how that direction was set, decision by decision, quarter by quarter, far from the factory floor, yet paid for in every rivet and rush sign-off. There was a time when the 737 MAX looked less like an airplane and more like a crime scene on every front page. To bring it back, Boeing had to do something it had spent years avoiding: slow down, open the hood, and let outsiders look at the code that ran its empire in the sky. The heart of that code was MCAS. Before the crashes, a single angle of attack vane could lie to the system, and the jet would believe it, driving the nose down again and again with almost no restraint. Afterward, the rules changed. MCAS was rewritten to compare data from both angle of attack sensors. If they disagreed beyond a tight threshold, the system would simply stand down. Even when it did activate, its power was capped, limited to a small one-time trim adjustment that pilots could counter with ordinary control forces instead of a desperate wrestling match. On paper, that sounds technical. In the cockpit, it meant something brutally simple. No more hidden, runaway nose-down commands repeating every few seconds. No more software quietly overpowering human hands. MCAS became just another modest stability aid, not an invisible master. It's an example of what happens when a company is forced to admit that redundancy is cheaper than funerals. The changes didn't stop at the code. Before, pilots were sold the story that the MAX flew like any other 737. No new tricks, no new training, nothing that might threaten the money machine of quick upgrades. After the grounding, that illusion died. New cockpit alerts warned crews when the two angle of attack sensors disagreed. The once optional disagree light became standard. Training materials were rewritten to name MCAS explicitly, explain when it could activate, and walk pilots step by step through how to shut it off using the same trim cutout switches that had existed for decades. Let me take you back to those months when the MAX sat frozen on tarmacs around the world, its nose cones capped, engines wrapped, and logos quietly turned away from cameras. Nearly 2 years of grounding followed the second crash, an unprecedented exile for a modern jet. Airlines parked hundreds of aircraft, bled money on lease payments and lost routes, and shuffled schedules like a casino dealer trying to hide a bad hand. Boeing itself burned through billions, took write-downs, watched orders evaporate, and saw a reputation built over a century reduced, almost overnight, to a question mark. To escape that limbo, the recertification had to be more than a paperwork ritual. Test pilots from Boeing and regulators flew the MAX again and again, deliberately provoking MCAS, stalling the jet, simulating failures, checking that the new logic behaved. Simulator sessions put line pilots through worst-case scenarios, while engineers watched every input and response. The FAA, stung by accusations of being too cozy, invited regulators from Europe, Canada, Brazil, and elsewhere to review the fixes, challenge assumptions, and run their own evaluations. For once, the empire of certification did not revolve around a single American office. Eventually, one by one, regulators cleared the MAX to fly again. Passengers returned, sometimes nervously, sometimes without even noticing the name on the safety card. On the surface, the story looked resolved. Software corrected, alerts added, training upgraded, money flowing again. Yet underneath, the deeper question remained. The code had been rewritten, but the culture that wrote the first version, the oversight that waved it through, and the ruthless pressure that made silence profitable, those were still very much alive, waiting for the next test of what this company valued most. On paper, the story looked wrapped up. Regulators had signed off. Airlines were scheduling flights, and the 737 MAX was back in the air, carrying families, business travelers, and crew who had read every headline. But trust doesn't reboot with a software patch. It has to climb back, foot by foot, through turbulence. There was a time when pilots were Boeing's loudest defenders, the living proof that the empire of engineering still cared about the people at the controls. After the grounding, that loyalty came with conditions. The Southwest Airlines Pilots Association announced that after reviewing the changes and going through new simulator sessions, they were confident the MAX was safe to fly. American Airlines captains stood in front of cameras, walked through the updated MCAS logic, the extra sensor data, the new checklists, and said calmly that they would put their own families on the jet. Confidence, yes. Blind faith? No. Behind those statements was a very deliberate life-or-death calculus. Pilots spent hours in simulators running failure after failure, feeling the nose pitch, practicing the cutout switches, learning what Boeing had once decided they did not need to know. Unions demanded written guarantees about training, fought for extra time in the box, and kept reminding the public that they had not been told about MCAS the first time. It was an example of what happens when a company treats knowledge as a line item on a budget instead of a safety net. Airlines, meanwhile, had their own problem: passengers. Some carriers tried radical transparency. They published aircraft types during booking, sent emails explaining the fixes, and quietly offered free rebooking to anyone who didn't want to fly the MAX. Others tried something more subtle. The word MAX began to disappear from marketing pages, replaced by neutral codes like 7378, as if a new label could erase 2 smoking craters and 346 funerals. Surveys showed how fractured the public had become. A chunk of travelers shrugged and said a plane was a plane. The ticket was cheap, the schedule worked, that was enough. Another group studied seat maps, cross-checked flight numbers, and canceled trips when they saw the wrong 3 letters. Flight attendants told stories of passengers stepping on, asking quietly, "Is this the MAX?" Then either relaxing in their seats or walking right back up the jet bridge. Underneath the noise sat a harder truth. Aviation safety rests on layers of redundancy. Machines that back each other up, regulators that challenge manufacturers, and a culture where bad news moves fast and is rewarded, not punished. When those layers fail together, when money and power lean on all of them at once, the damage isn't just technical. It is moral, at times inspiring, and at times chilling, because the system only works when everyone believes that safety wins every argument. So even if the MAX, line by line, is now one of the most scrutinized jets in history, the story exposed vulnerabilities that reach far beyond a single model. And the next time a new design is rushed to market under the same pressures, the question will not be, can you trust this plane? But something far more unsettling. Something far more unsettling. Because the story doesn't end with the MAX. There was a time when a Boeing airliner rolling out of the factory was treated almost like a sacred object, the culmination of an engineering priesthood that guarded every rivet. After the MAX, passengers might have expected a humbled company, a return to that older religion of caution. Instead, as investigators and airlines looked elsewhere in Boeing's empire, they began to find new cracks in the altar. Let me take you back to the 787 Dreamliner, the jet that was supposed to prove Boeing's future was bright, light, and efficient. Composite fuselage, global supply chain, aggressive cost targets. It was the plane that promised airlines lower fuel bills and promised Wall Street higher margins. But behind the marketing, inspectors began discovering something far less glamorous: tiny gaps where fuselage sections met, surfaces that weren't perfectly flush, tolerances stretched in the name of speed. On paper, these were just measurements. In real life, they raised the specter of long-term fatigue, of microscopic stresses building over years. Airlines opened up brand new Dreamliners and found tools and debris left in compartments, foreign objects in places that should have been pristine. In some fuel tanks, workers had literally left trash behind. The symbolism was hard to miss. In a company once obsessed with cleanliness and order, the mess was now sealed inside the wings. Regulators and airline engineers started asking the same uncomfortable question: if this is what can be seen, what remains hidden? The pattern felt eerily familiar. Production pressure at Boeing's South Carolina plant, heavy reliance on contractors, managers warning that slowing the line would cost too much money. Quality inspectors complained about being sidelined or outnumbered. The details were different from MCAS, but the logic was the same. Then came the 797 MAX, Boeing's next flagship, meant to restore prestige and compete with Airbus at the top end of the market. Instead of a triumphant launch, the program was hit with delay after delay. Test flights exposed engine problems, certification hurdles, even concerns about the way Boeing documented its own safety analysis. The FAA, burned by the MAX, refused to accept old shortcuts. What had once been a smooth regulatory glide path became a slog. Because of years of cost-cutting, outsourcing, and a leadership culture that treated engineering as a line item rather than a core identity, Boeing's problems had migrated from one program to another. It's an example of what happens when a company tries to financial engineer its way past the hard, slow work of building safe machines. The MAX was not an isolated tragedy. It was a warning flare. And yet, just when it seemed the lessons were unavoidable, another crisis would jolt the public awake, reminding everyone that this story, at times inspiring and at times chilling, was still being written. There was a time when the letters FAA were treated almost like a seal of infallibility. If the FAA said an airplane was safe, that was it. Case closed. After the MAX, that quiet confidence shattered, and suddenly the regulators themselves were dragged under the microscope. Let me take you back to those first months after the second crash, when investigators were still pulling wreckage from the ground and families were demanding answers. Inside the FAA, emergency review teams were formed, emails were seized, and decades of habit were put on trial. Internal audits showed how much of Boeing's certification work had been delegated back to Boeing, how engineers on the company payroll were effectively signing off on their own designs, and how MCAS had slipped through with single sensor dependence and minimal scrutiny. Outside, the judgment was even harsher. Congressional hearings played out like a public X-ray of the agency's life, exposing years of budget pressure, understaffing, and a culture that trusted Boeing's word far more than it verified. The Department of Transportation's Inspector General, the National Transportation Safety Board, even international panels all converged on the same theme. This wasn't just Boeing's failure. It was a system that had grown too cozy, too deferential, and too sure of itself. So the reform agenda arrived fast and heavy. Lawmakers talked about tightening the reins on delegated authority, demanding that the FAA reclaim direct control over the most critical systems rather than outsourcing them. Proposals called for independent technical review panels, more robust data analysis, and a hard rule that anything capable of flying the airplane without pilot input would face intense, standalone scrutiny. Whistleblower protections were put on the table, promising that engineers who raised red flags about safety would be shielded from retaliation instead of quietly sidelined. On paper, it sounded like the empire of self-policing was finally being cut down to size. In practice, a different power stepped forward. Industry lobbyists warned of catastrophe if reforms went too far. Endless delays for new jets, massive costs passed on to airlines and passengers, a loss of U.S. competitiveness as foreign manufacturers supposedly raced ahead under looser rules. The message was clear: push too hard on safety, and the money, the jobs, the national prestige would all be at risk. Meanwhile, other regulators sensed an opening. EASA in Europe, long accustomed to deferring to the FAA on American designs, began asserting its independence. For the MAX return to service, European engineers ran their own flight tests, demanded their own MCAS changes, and refused to simply rubber stamp Washington's conclusions. Canada and others followed, sometimes requiring additional pilot training or software revisions beyond what the FAA insisted was enough. Because of this split, passengers watching from the outside were left with an uneasy question. If regulators disagreed on what safe meant, who should be believed? And deeper still, can any watchdog truly regain public trust while its budget, expertise, and daily rhythm remain so deeply intertwined with the very industry it is supposed to restrain? Inside Boeing, that uneasy public question had already been answered in a quieter, more troubling way. For years, internal reviews and outside panels had been warning that the company's own watchdogs were losing power inside its walls. There was a time when Boeing's identity was simple. Engineers ran the show, and everything else existed to support them. After the McDonnell Douglas merger, internal culture surveys and later congressional investigations painted a different picture. Communication lines were fractured, programs were siloed, and critical safety concerns often died 3 levels down in the hierarchy, long before they could threaten a delivery schedule or a quarterly earnings call. Independent panels interviewed employees who described safety meetings where engineering voices were present but not decisive. Program managers, facing fierce competition from Airbus and relentless promises to Wall Street, pushed for on-time milestones, on-budget performance, and no surprises. When those goals collided with safety or design concerns, the reports found it was usually safety that yielded. Not in a dramatic movie scene, but in 100 quiet compromises. a test deferred, a warning label softened, a risk classification nudged one box lower. Internal audits of the 737 MAX program showed how this played out in real life. Safety and engineering teams technically existed, but their authority was often subordinated to program management and financial priorities. Reporting lines blurred with some safety personnel embedded in the very business units whose timelines they were supposed to challenge. It's an example of what happens when the referee's paycheck depends on the home team winning. Employees told investigators that the speak-up culture had eroded. There were hotlines, ombuds offices, ethics posters on the wall, but the lived message was different. Raised concerns too forcefully, and career prospects could stall. Questioned schedule assumptions, and a manager might quietly suggest being more flexible. The formal policy said any worker could stop production for safety. The informal reality was that hitting pause could mark someone as not a team player. The cultural audits did not just diagnose, they prescribed. Elevate safety roles so that the chief engineer and chief safety officer report directly to the CEO and the board. Restructure reporting lines so that safety engineers are independent of program budgets. Embed safety metrics into executive evaluations and bonuses, right alongside delivery numbers and cash flow. In other words, tie money and power to the thing the company claimed to value most. On paper, Boeing accepted many of these recommendations. New councils were formed, new titles created, new slogans rolled out. Yet the same reports warned that changing entrenched corporate behavior is slow, uneven, and easily derailed the moment a major program slips or a big customer threatens to walk. The real test would not be what executives promised in Washington, but what mid-level managers did when the next schedule crisis hit. And that crisis was already forming, because while the culture was being audited, another, harsher judge was still waiting: the courtroom. But before walking into that courtroom, hold that image of Boeing for a second and pull the camera wider, because this story is not the story of one company alone. In the same skies, chasing the same airlines, another empire was building jets under a very different set of assumptions about power, control, and what a pilot is actually for. Let me take you back to a hangar in Toulouse rather than Seattle. There was a time when Boeing's identity was almost a religion: pilots in charge, hands on the yoke, machines that would obey even a bad command because the human in the cockpit was king. Across the Atlantic, Airbus grew up with another creed. Computers would watch the humans. Software would set hard limits. If a pilot hauled back too far, the plane would say no. On an Airbus, fly-by-wire meant the side stick talked to computers, and the computers talked to the wings, with layers of protections that refused to let the jet stall, overspeed, or pull so many Gs that the airframe cried out. On a Boeing, especially in its classic lines, the pilot could still push the airplane right to the edge. His story is one of authority. Airbus's story is one of constraint. Two philosophies, flying the same passengers for the same ticket money. When Airbus launched the A320neo, it was chasing the same prize as the 737 MAX. More fuel efficiency, more range, more profit per seat. New engines, new aerodynamics, the same brutal economics. The rollout was not clean. Engines ran too hot, fan blades cracked. Airlines had to park jets and juggle schedules while mechanics crawled over nacelles in the desert sun. But what never appeared was a crisis on the scale of the MAX. No hidden flight control law quietly grafted into fake familiar handling. No global grounding after two nearly identical disasters. The difference was not that Airbus was noble and Boeing was uniquely ruthless. Airbus faced its own tragedies, its own design controversies, its own arguments over whether protections made pilots complacent. But structurally, it answered to a web of European governments, unions, and regulators that were less impressed by quarterly earnings calls and more obsessed with political embarrassment. A fatal design flaw in a flagship jet would not only cost money, it would humiliate nations. Meanwhile, Boeing, after the McDonnell Douglas merger, reported to a market that rewarded financial engineering, share buybacks, and cost discipline with instant wealth on the stock chart. It's an example of what happens when safety is treated as a constraint on growth rather than the foundation of the business. Different boards, different regulators, different incentives, different tolerance for betting lives against deadlines. This contrast is not about heroes and villains. It is a reminder that Boeing's path to the MAX was only one path among many available in a high-stakes industry. Another giant, facing the same fuel prices, the same airline demands, made different trade-offs and landed in a different place. And now, with that parallel in mind, the courtroom's questions start to sound sharper. Was the MAX disaster an accident of fate, or the predictable outcome of the path Boeing chose? There was a time when Boeing didn't need to say the word safety. It was assumed, woven into the company's life like rivets into a wing. Later, when that quiet confidence began to crumble, the word started showing up everywhere. In glossy ads and airshow videos, Boeing called itself the company that puts safety first, always. Executives stood on stages and promised that safety is our highest priority, that every decision begins and ends with safety. After the first 737 MAX crash, press releases insisted that the jet was as safe as any airplane that has ever flown. The language was absolute, almost liturgical. If you only watched the commercials, you would think this empire of aluminum and carbon fiber was held together by pure virtue. But let me take you back to the other side of the house. Inside Boeing's email servers, a different script was running. Employees joked that the MAX was designed by clowns, who are in turn supervised by monkeys. Others bragged about using Jedi mind tricks on regulators to avoid extra simulator training that would cost airlines money and delay schedules. When engineers raised concerns, managers replied with lines like, "We can't afford another slip, and we're already behind Airbus." The priority list was clear: schedule, cost, then somewhere down the page, safety margins. Because leadership needed both worlds to exist at once, Boeing drifted into safety theater. Highly visible gestures, low actual impact. New committees were formed, slogans were printed, posters declared zero accidents in bold blue letters. Executives filmed heartfelt videos about learning from tragedy, about honoring the families. Yet MCAS still depended on a single angle of attack sensor. Training documents still buried the system in fine print. The root causes stayed largely untouched, while the optics got a full makeover. Inside the company, that gap between the poster and the paycheck did something corrosive. When an engineer sees a banner that says, "Safety is our core value," then watches a program manager get rewarded for shaving weeks off a schedule by pushing back on test data, the message is clear. Values are what you print. Incentives are what you pay. Over time, people stop believing the speeches. They become cynical, then quiet, then compliant. His story is one of how a culture can be rewritten not by one ruthless order, but by 1,000 small promotions and 1,000 ignored warnings. And this is where the story reaches beyond Boeing. Next time a hospital system promises patient safety above all, or a rideshare app claims that Your safety is our top concern. It's an example of what happens when language runs ahead of reality. The question is simple. When you hear those promises, what lies behind them? The incentives or the posters? Behind those posters and taglines are faces. Let me take you back to a quiet Sunday morning in Addis Ababa. On Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, there was a young Kenyan software engineer heading to a UN conference, thinking about a promotion and the house he was saving for. There was an Italian aid worker who had spent years in refugee camps, finally taking a routine flight to another meeting. There was a Rwandan mother traveling with her 9-year-old daughter, a girl who loved science experiments and window seats. 91 seconds after takeoff, their stories ended in a field. There was a time when the Lion Air crash near Jakarta was described as an overseas incident, distant, abstract, almost a footnote in a quarterly report. On that flight, an Indonesian budget analyst was flying home to see his newborn son. A young newlywed couple was returning from a short beach holiday. A veteran captain in the cabin jump seat was hitching a ride, not knowing he'd be spending his last minutes trying to save an airplane whose own maker hadn't fully told pilots how it behaved. For Boeing, 346 dead became a number. For the families, it became a calendar. Birthdays that never arrive, school graduations with an empty chair, a life measured in memorial services, anniversaries of impact, and court dates. Many of them met online first, scattered across continents, then in hotel conference rooms and church basements, building an unexpected community out of shared disaster. They refused to let their loved ones become line items. Parents from Canada, widows from Kenya, siblings from Indonesia traveled to Washington, to Chicago, to Seattle, sitting through hearings where executives talked about returning the MAX to service, while they clutched photographs and translated corporate euphemisms back into human language. Some learned to read accident reports and legal filings the way they once read bedtime stories, underlining paragraphs that mentioned MCAS, angle of attack sensors, certification shortcuts, civil lawsuits against Boeing, against suppliers, against the airlines themselves opened a different kind of black box. Through discovery came internal emails calling the MAX a joke, messages mocking regulators, PowerPoints showing how much money would be saved by avoiding simulator training. Lawyers deposed engineers and managers who described schedule pressure, design compromises, and a culture where speaking up could end a career. The empire of safety branding began to look, at times inspiring and at times chilling, like an empire of liability management. The emotional toll was brutal. Families sat feet away from the executives whose signatures had approved the plane, listening to carefully rehearsed apologies, then walked out to parking lots and screamed or sat in silence. They watched animation of the final flights, second by second, as their children's last moments were turned into exhibits. Some accepted settlements, others refused, arguing that money without accountability was just another cost of doing business. Because for them, no software patch, no redesigned cockpit, no check with the many zeros can restore the life that was lost. It can only draw a line that says this must never happen again. The question is whether that line will hold when the next deadline hits, the next rival gains ground, and the same ruthless incentives come roaring back. There was a time when the decision seemed obvious. Airbus had the A320neo, airlines wanted fuel savings, and Wall Street wanted speed. Boeing chose the shortcut, re-engineer the 737 again, promise no new training, and keep the money flowing. But imagine, just for a moment, that the board had flinched, that someone in that room said no. Let me take you back to that fork in the road. Same pressure, same rival, same ruthless timetable. Only this time, instead of asking how to stretch a 1960s airframe one more inch, The question becomes, what if the empire of the jet age actually built a new jet? An all-new narrow body, clean sheet, with no baggage from the past, and no need to pretend it was just another 737. In that alternate timeline, the meeting ends differently. The engineers, not the finance team, walk out with the mandate. The PowerPoint slides promise a decade-long program, tens of billions in upfront costs, and years when profits will sag and investors will complain. The analysts downgrade the stock. Commentators mutter that Boeing has lost its edge. The money, for a while, looks worse, but the airplane looks better. From day one, the wings are sculpted purely for modern aerodynamics, not trapped by old landing gear geometry. The engines are placed exactly where they should be for efficiency and stability, not wedged higher and farther forward to clear a low-slung fuselage. The system's architecture is drawn clean, with digital backbones, robust redundancy, and no need for a secret software bandage to hide a handling quirk. In that world, there is no MCAS quietly waiting in the background, no single $2 sensor with the power to drag a jet toward the ground. Pilots train on a new type because it is honestly new. Simulators are not an accounting problem, they are part of the product. The sales pitch is harder in the short term, but the story is cleaner. Safety is not something to be threaded through loopholes. It is etched into the design. Because of that harder choice, Boeing's life looks different. The company bleeds cash in the early years, fights nervous shareholders, and listens to endless comparisons with the faster Airbus upgrade. Yet, as the new jet enters service, the narrative flips. Airlines get lower fuel burn without hidden compromises, regulators see transparency instead of evasion, and the old reputation for engineering excellence, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its ambition, suddenly feels real again. Two crashes never happen. Families never learn the name MCAS. Congressional hearings about text messages mocking regulators never take place. The brand that helped win wars and connect continents does not spend years explaining why a modern airliner needed a software patch to behave. It's an example of what happens when short-term financial logic wins the argument. The costs do not vanish. They merely arrive later, multiplied, and paid in a currency far more brutal than quarterly earnings. And it raises a harder question for every boardroom watching. When the next fork appears, will the road not taken still be the one that would have saved them? That fork in the road is not unique to one boardroom in Seattle. There was a time when only airplane makers faced those choices, but now every high-risk industry sits on the same knife edge, trading code for steel, data for lives, and quarterly earnings for long-term trust. The Boeing story is not just about one plane. It is a warning label for an entire technological empire. Lesson 1 is brutal in its simplicity. Do not let financial engineering outrun real engineering. When spreadsheets start winning arguments over physics, the outcome is predictable, only the timing is uncertain. In autonomous vehicles, that might look like shipping self-driving software because a demo is scheduled, even though the edge case tests are still failing. In medical devices, it might mean releasing an insulin pump with a known glitch, because fixing it would delay revenue. It's an example of what happens when money quietly becomes the chief engineer. Lesson 2. Never hide complexity from the people whose lives depend on it. Boeing buried MCAS behind familiar cockpit layouts and reassurances about just another 737. Other fields are tempted to do the same. A hospital that installs AI diagnostic tools but gives doctors no real explanation of failure modes is repeating that pattern. A nuclear plant that relies on opaque vendor software without training operators on what happens when sensors disagree is playing the same game. The interface can be simple, but the truth behind it cannot be a secret. Lesson 3 is older than jet travel. Redundancy is not optional. One sensor, one path, one safeguard is an invitation, not a barrier. In nuclear power, that is why control rods, cooling systems, and backup generators are layered, cross-checked, and physically separated. In large-scale software, it is why responsible teams assume servers will fail, networks will partition, and users will do the unexpected, then build backups for their backups. His story is one of engineering humility. The moment a system believes it will probably be fine, it has already failed. Underneath all of this sits a quieter danger, the normalization of deviance. A test skipped here, a waiver signed there, a policy temporarily relaxed to hit a deadline, and soon the exception becomes the rule. Space agencies, chemical plants, crypto exchanges, all have lived this progression, at times inspiring and at times chilling, until a catastrophe finally reveals how far the line has moved. To resist that drift, independent oversight is not a nuisance. It is part of the safety system. Regulators who are too close to the companies they oversee, boards paid in stock options that reward short-term spikes, weak whistleblower, channels that punish the messenger rather than the message, all tilt the field toward silence. When a junior engineer in a car factory, a software tester in a fintech startup, or a technician in a reactor control room can raise a hand without risking their career, the whole system becomes less fragile. In the end, Boeing is not just a villain in this story. It is a mirror. Its rise from wartime hero to peacetime icon to humble giant reflects vulnerabilities shared across modern, tech-driven industries, where wealth, power, and speed tempt leaders to forget that gravity, biology, and code do not negotiate. The next chapters will be written by the industries that choose to look into that mirror and the ones that refuse. Boeing looked into that mirror, and under the harsh glare of investigations and public fury, did something it had resisted for years. It admitted that safety could no longer be treated as a line item. The company announced a new permanent safety committee on its board, rewired reporting lines so engineers could bypass managers, and promised that anyone, anywhere in the empire, could raise a concern without fear. On paper, it sounded like a return to the old religion. Suddenly, there was a chief aerospace safety officer, a standalone product and services safety organization, and an internal hotline meant to capture every whisper of risk. Certification teams were reshuffled, flight test data was given more prominence, and Boeing told regulators that MCAS-type surprises would never again be buried in the fine print. There was a time when this company bragged that every bolt had a reason. Now it was forced to prove that every decision did too. Leadership, the face of the crisis, also changed. Dennis Muilenburg, the engineer turned CEO who had still spoken fluent Wall Street, was removed. In his place came David Calhoun, a longtime board member with deep private equity and finance experience, a man whose life had been spent moving numbers, not rivets. The message was mixed. New safety titles multiplied, yet the person holding ultimate power over money and schedule was again someone from the financial side, not the drafting table. Early on, there were signs the shock had landed. The 737 MAX stayed grounded for nearly 2 years, while software was rewritten, sensors were doubled, training was expanded, and regulators from Europe, Canada, and Brazil refused to simply copy the FAA's homework. Engineers regained leverage to slow programs, suppliers were pressed less ruthlessly, and internal safety surveys showed a small but real rise in people willing to speak up. His story is one of a company trying to rediscover a conscience under subpoena. But the empire's old habits did not retire quietly. New quality issues surfaced. Loose debris in 737 fuel tanks, misdrilled holes on 787 fuselages, and in 2024, an alarming mid-air panel blowout on a nearly new 737 MAX 9. Each incident chipped away at the promise that this was a clean break from the past. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the reform narrative kept colliding with headlines that looked uncomfortably familiar. Because the deeper problem was never just structure, it was incentives. Quarterly earnings targets, shareholder buybacks, and airline customers demanding more seats for less cash did not vanish when the new committees appeared. Engineers still felt schedule pressure, managers still knew their bonuses depended on deliveries, and the market still rewarded short-term wealth over long-term resilience. It's an example of what happens when a culture tries to change while its reward system does not. So the question lingers over every flight that leaves the gate. Is Boeing truly walking back toward its engineering roots? Or has it learned to speak the language of safety while running the same business model underneath? Let me take you back to the next turning point where that answer will be forced into the open. Let me take you back to a scene that looks harmless. A boarding gate, a rolling suitcase, a half-finished coffee. Your group is called, you scan the ticket, walk down the jet bridge, and step into a machine that weighs tens of tons and flies 7 miles above the earth. You find your seat, wrestle with the overhead bin, and buckle in. The cabin lights dim, the safety demo plays, and the engines start to hum. It feels routine. Yet under that calm, there is a life or death story written in wiring diagrams, software code, and boardroom memos. Most passengers have no idea which one they are riding on. There was a time when the bragging rights were simple. A company would say every bolt had a reason, every system had redundancy, every failure was imagined before it ever happened. Now imagine realizing, as the plane pushes back, that this particular design was also shaped by quarterly earnings targets, market share panic, and promises to airlines about no new simulator training. The thought lands, then gets interrupted by the flight attendant asking about drinks. That's the pattern. A brief awareness, quickly drowned in routine. Yet the aircraft is held aloft by thousands of choices. How much authority to give one sensor, how to word a manual, whether to flag a concern or stay quiet to protect a career, a bonus, an empire of contracts. Extend that frame beyond the cabin, the car that brakes for you on the highway, the elevator that glides you to the 40th floor, the medical pump that doses a child in the ICU, the software that routes your family's money through invisible networks, all of them built by organizations balancing safety, schedule, and profit, sometimes with ruthless discipline, sometimes with reckless shortcuts. This is not an invitation to panic every time the doors close. Aircraft, cars, hospitals, even code are safer on average than at almost any point in history. The discomfort matters for a different reason. It reveals how much blind trust flows every day into unseen systems and distant institutions, how easily wealth and power can drift away from the people strapped into the seats. Because of stories like Boeing's, the question shifts from, is flying safe, to who is being watched? It's an example of what happens when a culture tells the public one story about safety while rewarding another story in private about cost. And once that pattern is visible, passengers are not just passengers anymore. Informed citizens can demand to know what software is doing, why training was skipped, who signed off on a single point of failure. Consumers can push regulators for teeth instead of press releases, lawmakers for hearings instead of headlines, companies for transparency instead of slogans that sound at times inspiring and at times chilling. The next chapter in Boeing's life is not only written in factories and courtrooms. It is written every time a boarding door closes and nobody asks how this machine was really made. In the next section, that quiet trust will meet the moment when the system fails in front of the whole world. That quiet trust will meet more than one bad day. It will meet a system that forgot what it was for. Because there was a time when Boeing's name meant engineering excellence, obsessive testing, and a kind of cold, reassuring competence that made passengers relax before the wheels even left the runway. Then the central question of this story walked in the door. What happens when a company built on that excellence starts serving Wall Street before passengers? Not only did Boeing answer it, it turned the answer into a business model. The merger with McDonnell Douglas didn't just add factories, it imported a culture where quarterly earnings, stock price, and financial engineering slowly outranked the engineers who used to argue over every bolt. From there, the chain reaction was almost elegant in its simplicity. Cost-cutting, schedule pressure, and a promise to airlines that the 737 MAX would be the same old plane with new engines, no simulator time needed, no expensive retraining. Marketing said no change. Physics disagreed. So the empire of spreadsheets went looking for a software patch. MCAS was the patch, a hidden line of code watching a single sensor, ready to shove the nose down again and again to make the MAX feel like its older cousins. It was tuned, expanded, and then quietly buried in manuals so that training slides stayed short and contracts stayed cheap. This wasn't an accident in one programmer's life. It was an example of what happens when safety becomes a variable to be traded, not a boundary that cannot be crossed. Lion Air 610 and Ethiopian 302 were the invoices for that decision chain. Two crews fighting a system they had never been properly told existed, alarms screaming, checklists colliding with reality, seconds bleeding away while a $2 sensor fed MCAS the wrong story about the angle of the sky. Regulators who had delegated oversight back to Boeing were suddenly announcing groundings. Executives who had chased wealth through buybacks and bonuses were now watching billions in market value evaporate in a few weeks. The crashes were never just about a bad line of code. They were about a moral drift where craftsmanship eroded into compliance, where internal messages mocked regulators, where good enough replaced the old religion of overbuilding everything. Boeing's legacy became split in two. The company that helped win wars, shrank continents, and put families on opposite sides of the world within hours. And the company that treated that same power as another way to hit a margin target. His story is one of awe and warning at once, at times inspiring and at times chilling. In the next section, that warning turns personal, as this corporate tragedy becomes a mirror for how each viewer thinks about power, risk, and responsibility in their own world. That mirror matters, even if you never set foot on a jet. Because Boeing is not just a story about airplanes, it's a manual for decoding the next headline that suddenly makes modern life feel a little less solid under your feet. There was a time when a plane crash, a bridge collapse, or a massive data breach looked like a freak accident, a tragic fluke in an otherwise reliable system. Now, after seeing how an empire like Boeing let a single $2 sensor steer a multi-billion-dollar program, those headlines start to rhyme. A rushed medical device recall, a social network hemorrhaging your family's data, a water system failing in a heat wave, different industries, same pattern. Cost targets up, safety margins down, warnings buried, and executives finally acting shocked when reality catches up. Stories like this teach a quiet rule. Whenever something huge fails, look at the incentive structure before the press conference. Who got paid for speed, for volume, for short-term money? Who lost power for slowing down? At Boeing, managers were rewarded for hitting delivery schedules, not for asking if MCAS should rely on one angle of attack sensor. That logic is not unique. It lives wherever quarterly earnings, app downloads, or political points are treated as more urgent than the slow, boring work of keeping people alive. So when a company rolls out a glossy new product, or a leader promises a revolutionary technology, the question is not only whether it looks impressive. The real question is who gets rewarded if corners are cut, and who has the authority to say no. Let me take you back to those internal Boeing messages, employees calling the MAX a joke while mocking regulators. It's an example of what happens when a culture quietly teaches that winning the game matters more than respecting the rules. What can an ordinary viewer actually do? Support strong, competent regulation instead of laughing it off as red tape. When a whistleblower risks a career to speak up, a Boeing engineer, a hospital nurse, a cybersecurity analyst, treat that as an early warning system, not an inconvenience. Reward companies that publish safety data, that accept slower growth to rebuild aging infrastructure, that invest in resilience instead of just marketing the illusion of it. Media and public scrutiny become the emergency brakes when internal systems fail. Boeing did not ground the MAX because it suddenly grew a conscience. It grounded the MAX under the weight of investigations, leaked emails, grieving families, and reporters refusing to look away. The same pressure forces a pipeline operator to reveal a spill, a tech giant to admit a breach, a contractor to fix a cracked bridge. Informed skepticism, then, is not cynicism. It is the price of living inside sprawling, invisible networks of power that move planes, data, water, and money around the world. Trust is still necessary. No one can inspect every line of code or every bolt on a wing. But trust, without questions, is how empires drift from at times inspiring and at times chilling into simply dangerous. And in the next part of this story, that tension between trust and doubt will come crashing into the people inside Boeing who finally decided to push back. So let me take you back to the beginning of this arc, because the ending only makes sense when the rise is still fresh in mind. There was a time when the Boeing name meant engineering purity, when every bolt, every rivet, every test flight was a kind of secular religion. The company that helped win World War II, that put the 707 and the 747 into the sky, lived by a simple rule. The engineers run the show, the money follows. Then came the McDonnell Douglas merger in 1997, and the center of gravity quietly slid. McDonnell's executives, trained to squeeze margins in an empire that had already fallen behind, took the big chairs. Power shifted from the wind tunnel to the spreadsheet. Safety, once a foundation, slowly became another line item to negotiate, delay, or optimize. On paper, Boeing was wealthier than ever. Inside, the culture that had built its legend was being hollowed out. When Airbus launched the A320neo with fuel-efficient engines and huge orders, that new leadership faced a choice. Spend the money and time to design a clean-sheet jet, or rush out an answer. They chose speed and cost. Instead of a new airplane, they stretched a 1960s design again, bolting larger engines onto the 737 airframe and pushing them higher and farther forward. The jet flew, but its aerodynamics changed. To make it feel like the old 737 and avoid expensive simulator training for airlines, Boeing reached for software. That software was MCAS. On paper, it was a small helper, a quiet system that would nudge the nose down if the angle of attack got too high. In practice, it was a powerful, repeatedly activating control law, secretly wired to a single sensor on the outside of the jet. One $2 vane misreading the wind could now command the entire airplane, and many pilots were never clearly told it existed. It's an example of what happens when a business model, not physics, writes the spec. Lion Air Flight 610 in Indonesia, then Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 near Addis Ababa, expose that choice in the most brutal way. Faulty angle of attack data, MCAS driving the nose down again and again, cockpits filled with alarms, crews fighting an enemy they had not been trained to name. Within 5 months, 2 nearly new planes plunged into the ground, 346 lives erased, and the world suddenly asking how the safest era in aviation could hide a trap like this. The fallout was swift and strangely slow at the same time. Regulators around the globe grounded the 737 MAX, while internal Boeing emails leaked showing employees calling the jet a joke and mocking the FAA. Whistleblowers described pressure to cut corners. Congressional hearings dragged executives into the spotlight, and multi-billion-dollar settlements tried to put a price on grief. Even after the MAX returned, new quality concerns on other Boeing jets kept surfacing, reminding everyone that this was not a one-off glitch, but a pattern. So the causal chain is brutally clear. A culture that once worshipped engineering let finance take the throne. That culture chose to stretch an old airframe instead of build a new one, then hid a powerful system to protect a marketing promise, then trusted a single sensor because redundancy was expensive. When safety became a negotiable expense instead of the ground floor, the bill finally came due with interest, and it was paid in lives, reputation, and a trust that may never fully return. And in the next part of this story, the question becomes unavoidable. After all of this, can Boeing truly rebuild that foundation? Or is the empire too committed to the very forces that broke it? There was a time when people assumed that if a logo had decades of glory behind it, the planes, the cars, the drugs it produced had to be safe. Boeing showed how wrong that faith can be. So before stepping onto the next miracle of modern engineering, it helps to carry a quiet checklist in the back of your mind. Start with the culture. Watch for the moment a company stops bragging about its builders and starts worshiping its bankers. When the legends are no longer the engineers who solved impossible problems, but the executives who returned cash to shareholders, that's a shift. After the McDonnell Douglas merger, Boeing's center of gravity slid from the drafting table to the spreadsheet, and the empire followed. It's an example of what happens when the people who ship products lose power to the people who ship earnings. Next, look at where the knives come out. Every business cuts costs, but in a healthy culture, safety-critical areas are sacred ground. With the 737 MAX, cost-cutting showed up exactly where it shouldn't, reusing an aging airframe, avoiding simulator training, relying on a single sensor to drive MCAS. When a company saves money by adding seat cushions, that's efficiency. When it saves money by quietly removing redundancy, that's a warning. Then examine the shadows around the regulator. Opaque, cozy relationships are another red flag. Boeing pushed the FAA to delegate more certification work back to Boeing employees, then mocked those same regulators in internal messages. If news coverage hints at regulatory streamlining, if earnings called praise harmonized oversight, ask whether that means smarter rules or simply fewer questions. Language is a tell. On paper, efficiency, streamlining, and innovation sound inspiring. In practice, when those words appear next to safety-critical products, they need translation. Efficiency can mean eliminating waste or eliminating inspections. Streamlining might remove pointless bureaucracy, or remove an independent review that catches fatal flaws. Innovation might describe a breakthrough or a creative way to hide risks from customers and pilots to protect market share and wealth. This checklist is not just for passengers and consumers. It belongs to employees sitting in design reviews, to managers in meetings, to citizens reading about a new drug, a bridge, a reactor. His story is one of how ordinary workers saw the danger, wrote emails, filed reports, and were brushed aside by a machine chasing money and schedule. When those dismissive attitudes toward internal critics appear, when whistleblowers are isolated instead of honored, the pattern is repeating. So let me take you back to that simple idea. Safety as the ground floor, not a negotiable expense. Use this framework when you read headlines, when you listen to earnings calls, when leaked documents surface with that same cold, familiar tone. Because if enough people can spot the next Boeing early, the next chapter of this story doesn't have to end in wreckage. And in the next section, the question becomes, who actually has the power to force that change? So when the question becomes, who actually has the power to force that change, let me take you back to that cockpit. Two pilots, hands locked on a shaking yoke, alarms screaming, the nose of a brand new jet lunging down again and again. No branding deck, no talking points. Just physics, software, and a rapidly shrinking margin for error. Passengers sit behind them, scrolling phones, half asleep, trusting the invisible empire of aviation to do what it has always promised, deliver them home. Up front, the trim wheel spins, warning lights flash, and a quiet line of code decides the next few seconds of their lives. There was a time when Boeing bragged that every bolt had a reason. Now, a hidden system is moving the tail, and the people responsible are thousands of miles away, sipping coffee in conference rooms. Draw a straight line from that chaos back through the years. Back to MCAS design meetings, where engineers are told the new engines must fit an old airframe, because a clean sheet jet would cost too much money and take too long. Back to marketing promises that the MAX flies just like the old 737, so airlines can avoid expensive simulator training. Back to certification shortcuts, where the FAA leans on Boeing's own people to sign off their work. Back to shareholder presentations celebrating record cash flow, while internal messages call the plane a joke. Every desperate pull on that yoke is the final chapter of a very different story. A story written in spreadsheets that model training cost to the dollar. In email threads arguing over whether to mention MCAS in the manual. In quiet decisions to trust a single angle of attack sensor because redundancy would be inconvenient. His story is one of ruthless financial engineering. This one is at times inspiring and at times chilling, because it shows what happens when that mindset migrates from boardroom to flight deck. It's an example of what happens when risk doesn't explode in one dramatic moment, but seeps in slowly. A compromise here, a delay there, a PowerPoint slide that buries a safety concern in 8 bullet points. No one meeting feels like a turning point. No one email reads like a confession. Yet, finally, all of those choices converge in a cockpit where alarms overlap and checklists run out. So when the news shows wreckage and headlines scream about pilot error or software glitches, remember what you're really seeing. Not just a crash, but the bill coming due on years of quiet decisions made by people who never had to buckle a seatbelt on that jet. And in the next section, the focus turns to those people directly. The executives, regulators, and investors who still hold the controls, and what happens when the public decides to reach for them. Despite everything that has already come out about Boeing, this story is not finished. not for the families who lost people, not for the engineers still biting their tongues in meetings, and not for anyone who steps onto a jet and pulls a seatbelt across their lap. There was a time when a logo on the tail meant something close to absolute faith. Boeing, the FAA, the airlines, the software, the sensors, the contracts behind them all. The whole invisible empire of metal and code was treated as a given, as solid as gravity. Now the cracks are visible. The question is what to do with that knowledge, because walking away from flying is not an option for most of modern life. So treat this story as a starting gun, not a closing argument. The next time a new plane is rushed to market, a certification rule is quietly streamlined, or a company brags about saving millions on training, keep asking the simple questions that rarely appear in glossy ads. Who benefits? Who decides? And who actually carries the risk when the cockpit alarms won't shut up? Follow the money because it's an example of what happens when safety becomes a line item instead of a religion. That means backing the people and institutions that keep pulling on loose threads. Support journalism that digs through emails, simulator logs, and board minutes instead of repeating press releases. Support regulators who demand full test data, who resist being turned into customer service for the industry they oversee. Inside companies, support cultures where a young engineer can say, "This isn't safe," without quietly ending a career. His story is one of courage, too, even when it never makes the news. Let me take you back to those internal Boeing messages calling the MAX a joke, mocking the very regulators signing off on it. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the real lesson is that someone wrote those lines, hit send, and expected nothing to change. That quiet expectation of no consequences is the real danger signal in any empire built on trust. So share this. With people who fly every week for work, with friends who write code for critical systems, with investors who cheer every cost cut, with officials who vote on budgets for oversight. Every extra pair of eyes on stories like this makes it harder to bury the next warning memo, to waive the next test, to shrug off the next near miss as pilot error. Because in a world where lives depend on machines and institutions none of us personally control, the only real power left is refusing to look away when the warning lights flash. The next crisis is already being drafted somewhere right now, in code pushed before review, in contracts written with clever loopholes, in meetings where an uncomfortable slide is quietly skipped. How it ends is not predetermined. It depends, in part, on how awake you choose to be now. Before the headline, before the impact, while there is still time to reach for the controls.